The scent of charred cedar and burnt lavender hung heavy over the valley, a sickly perfume that choked the morning air. Where the Miller farm once stood, only blackened ribs of timber clawed at the New Mexico sky. The heat still rose in shimmering waves from the foundation, a ghost of the fire that had consumed everything. Sheriff Miller didn't look at the ruin. He looked at his boots, polished and pitiless against the grey ash. Billy stood on the ridge, his eyes stinging from the drifting soot. He felt the rough grain of his Winchester's stock against his thumb, a familiar comfort in a world gone jagged. The sun was a brass coin tossed into a dusty sky, offering heat but no warmth. He remembered the smell of fresh bread from that kitchen just a week ago. He remembered Sarah Miller's hands, red and chapped from work, but gentle when she handed him a canteen. "They didn't have to do it, kid," whispered Chavez, standing beside him. Billy didn't answer. He watched the sheriff's men ride away, their laughter carried thin and tinny by the wind. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. It was a silence that tasted of copper and old regrets. He looked at the scorched earth where a small garden had been struggling to bloom. Sarah couldn't have known that giving a thirsty man a cup of water would cost her the roof over her head. The sheriff called it harboring a fugitive, but Billy knew it was just a message written in fire. The boundary between law and cruelty had blurred until it disappeared entirely. "We're heading deep into the Jornada del Muerto," Billy finally said, his voice a low rasp. "Let 'em think the desert swallowed us whole." He reached into his vest and pulled out a small tarnished brass key Sarah had given him for the root cellar, the only thing that hadn't burned. It felt cold, a weight of autonomy in a palm mapped by scars. He gripped it tight. "Only if you want it to be," she had told him when he asked if the West was truly as wild as they said. Now the words felt like a curse. They turned their horses toward the shimmering horizon, where the sand met the sky in a haze of heat. The desert was a furnace, a place where secrets went to die and men became legends or dust. Billy didn't look back at the smoke. He looked forward into the blinding white light of the wasteland, waiting for the fire in his blood to match the sun. The Jornada del Muerto took no prisoners, and as the horses pushed deeper into the parched throat of the wasteland, every breath Billy drew felt like a lungful of liquid gold and stinging grit. The rhythmic thud-clop of the stallion's hooves on the sun-baked clay was the only heartbeat in a world that seemed to have died 1,000 years ago, leaving behind only the bleached bones of cattle and the whispering ghosts of ancient mountains. He noticed the way the light fractured off the mica-flecked stones, creating a kaleidoscope of blinding flashes that made his vision dance with shadows that weren't there. The smell of his own sweat, salty and sharp against the coarse wool of his vest, mixed with the musky heat of the animal beneath him, creating an atmosphere of raw, animal survival that stripped away the myth of the kid and left only a man forged in the furnace of the frontier. His thumb traced the jagged teeth of the brass key inside his pocket, a cold anchor in a world that was rapidly turning to liquid fire and shimmering mirages. To the sheriff, that key was a worthless scrap of metal pulled from a pile of ash, but to Billy it was a heavy piece of the dignity Sarah had tried to plant in the New Mexico soil, a legacy that now burned a hole in his soul. They watched the horizon for any sign of pursuit, but the lawmen were far behind, tethered to their comfortable lives and the safety of town borders, while Billy drifted into a lawless sanctuary where only the strong or the desperate dared to tread. The silence of the wasteland wasn't empty. It was a heavy, expectant thing, filled with the ghosts of the farm and the echo of a laughter that had been silenced by the sheriff's matchstick, forcing Billy to realize that his path was no longer about escape, but about an inevitable circular return. As the sun began its slow, agonizing descent, painting the distant mesas in hues of bruised purple and dried blood, the texture of the desert began to change beneath them. The loose, shifting sand gave way to the iron-hard red earth of the high canyons, where the wind whistled through sandstone arches like a funeral dirge for a life he could no longer claim. The scent of sagebrush and distant cedar smoke, real or imagined, teased his nostrils, a signal that they were crossing an invisible boundary into a land where the white man's maps were nothing more than meaningless scratches on paper. She couldn't have known that her simple kindness would send him on this trajectory, a bullet fired from the heart of a burning house into the vast, indifferent wilderness where the Apache held the secrets of the rock and the sky. He pulled his Stetson lower, the brim casting a sharp shadow over eyes that had seen too much for a boy of his years, but just enough for the legend he was forced to inhabit. The phrase, "only if you want it to be," echoed in the chambers of his mind like a spent casing hitting the floorboards, a reminder that the Wild West was a canvas painted by those with the will to hold the brush and the steel to back it up. He wasn't just riding toward a hideout or a temporary reprieve from the gallows. He was riding toward a transformation, a place where the fire in his veins would eventually cool into a hardened, lethal resolve. The key in his palm felt less like a weight and more like a tool of reclamation, a promise to the wind and the dust that the ash of the Miller farm would not be the final word in the story of Lincoln County. The Jornada del Muerto was a land of beautiful cruelty. The air was so dry it cracked the skin on Billy's lips, tasting of salt and ancient stone. Every mile was a test of bone and spirit. The horses' hooves made a rhythmic thud crunch on the baked clay, the only sound for hours except for the occasional whistle of a hawk overhead. On the third day, the water ran low. The heat was a physical weight, a shimmering curtain that distorted the mesas into floating fortresses. Billy felt the grit of sand between his teeth and the coarse friction of his wool vest against his sun-scorched neck. He noticed the way the wind shifted, carrying the faint metallic tang of water and the musk of unwashed buckskin. A line of silhouettes appeared on the ridge, perfectly still against the setting sun. They were Apache, shadows woven from the desert itself. Billy raised his hand, palm open, the universal sign of a man with nothing to hide and everything to lose. The lead warrior, an older man with skin like weathered oak, rode down the slope. His eyes were dark pools of ancient knowledge. The chief did not speak immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the flat, sun-baked earth, where the heat still hummed like a disturbed hornet's nest. Billy dismounted, his joints popping with a sound like dry kindling snapping, and reached into his saddlebag to retrieve a small pouch of Virginia tobacco. The scent of the dried leaves, sweet and earthy, cut through the oppressive smell of dust and sun-withered sagebrush. He noticed the way the younger warrior's hands never left their lances, their knuckles white against the dark, polished wood, yet the old man's gaze remained as steady as the North Star. With a slow, deliberate movement, Billy offered the pouch, a gesture of peace that felt heavier than the colt hanging at his hip. They sat in a circle as the sky bled from a bruised purple into the deep, star-choked black of a desert night, the air turning from a furnace to a biting, crystalline cold. The fire they built was small, a flickering heart of orange light that smelled of cedar smoke and old memories. They watched. The Apache warriors observed the way Billy tended to the horses first, his hands moving with a practiced, wordless grace over their weary flanks before he ever sought water for himself. The chief leaned forward, the flickering light dancing in the deep creases of his face, and spoke of the white man's law as a fence that sought to choke the life out of the grass. Billy looked at the tarnished brass key resting in his palm, its cold metal a sharp contrast to the heat of the small fire, and realized that his journey was more than a flight from a hangman's noose. He thought of the Miller Ranch, the smell of lavender Sarah had tried so hard to grow in a land that preferred thorns, and the way the sheriff's fire had tried to erase her autonomy. The chief reached out, his fingers rough and dry like canyon sandstone, and touched the key. nodding as if he understood the weight of the ghosts Billy carried. She couldn't have known that her kindness would forge a link between an Irish outlaw and the guardians of the Red Earth, yet here they were, sharing a silence that was more honest than any word spoken in a Lincoln courtroom. As the first sliver of dawn began to peel back the darkness, painting the mesas in shades of ochre and rust, Billy felt a strange clarity settle over him, a cold resolve that the desert had gifted his soul. The boundary between the life he had lived and the one he was about to claim was as sharp as the edge of an obsidian blade, a frontier of choice that demanded everything. "Only if you want it to be," he whispered to the wind, echoing Sarah's voice as he prepared to turn his horse back toward the civilization that had branded him a monster. He left a small, carved wooden bird near the spring, a token of respect for a culture that lived with the land rather than against it, and rode out, the rhythm of the desert now pulsing in his veins like a war drum. "You seek the shade of the Great Spirit, little brother?" the chief asked in a voice that sounded like grinding stones. The interaction was not one of conquest, but of survival. Billy shared his tobacco, the dry leaves smelling of earth and honey. In return, they sat by a small hidden spring where the water was sweet and cold, a miracle in the middle of a furnace. The chief spoke of the land, not as property to be fenced, but as a living thing that breathed through the canyons. They watched. The warriors watched Billy as he tended to a lame horse with a tenderness that defied his reputation. He didn't use the whip. He used a low hum and a steady hand. The chief nodded slowly, seeing the softer side that the lawmen in Lincoln County chose to ignore. "The law of the white man is like the tumbleweed," the chief said, looking at the fire. "It has no roots. It only goes where the wind blows. Your heart has roots, young one, but roots in a fire will only turn to coal." Billy looked at the horizon, where the stars were beginning to pierce the purple velvet of the night. He thought of the sheriff's badge, a star made of cold tin. He thought of the Miller farm. The peace here was a fragile thing, a temporary border between his past and his purpose. He knew he couldn't stay in the sanctuary of the Red Earth forever. The return to the outskirts of Lincoln was a descent into a different kind of heat. The air in the valley was thick with the smell of horse manure, cheap whiskey, and the metallic ozone of an approaching storm. Billy sat in the shadows of an abandoned stable, the rough hay pricking through his shirt. He cleaned his Colt 45 with a piece of oiled rag, the rhythmic click-slide of the cylinder a prayer of preparation. The town was a hive of nervous energy. The sheriff had doubled the guards, his fear manifesting as a tightening noose around the necks of the townspeople. Billy watched from the loft as a young girl struggled with a heavy bucket of water near the well. Without a word, he descended, masked by the dusk, and took the weight from her. The girl's eyes, wide as silver dollars, reflected the flickering lantern light that seemed far too fragile for the heavy, suffocating darkness of the valley. As Billy set the bucket down, the sloshing water darkened the dry, thirsty boards of the porch, smelling of deep wells and ancient mossy stones. He noticed the way her small hands were raw from the biting chill of the evening air, a mirror to the chapped, hard-working hands of Sarah Miller before the fire had turned her life into a memory of ash. Without a word, he pressed the small wooden bird he had carved into her palm, the cedar, smooth and still smelling faintly of the high desert he had just left behind. It was a fragment of a different world, a token of autonomy in a town where even the breath in one's lungs felt like it was on loan from the sheriff's cruel ledger. Further down the street, the Silver Spur Saloon exhaled a cloud of thick tobacco smoke and the tinny, discordant sound of a player piano that lacked a soul. The sheriff sat on the boardwalk in a tilted chair, the light from the window catching the cold, hard edge of his badge. A star that promised order, but delivered only the scent of scorched earth. They watched, the deputies from their hidden shadows and the terrified pioneers from behind their boarded windows, as the atmosphere grew heavy with the electric charge of the approaching thunderheads. The wind began to howl between the buildings, carrying the sharp scent of rain, but it was a promise of a flood that would wash away the sins of the valley rather than nourish its soil. Billy slipped back into the darkness of the alleyways, his boots making no more sound than a ghost crossing a graveyard, his mind focused on the thin, blurred boundary between what the law demanded and what justice required. He reached into the pocket of his coarse wool vest, his thumb tracing the jagged cold teeth of the root cellar key, the last piece of metal that hadn't surrendered to the sheriff's torches. The Apache chief's words echoed in his mind, like the low, rhythmic rumble of the mountains, a reminder that roots without a home are merely fuel for the next man's blaze. The desert had stripped him of everything but his resolve, leaving a man who was less an outlaw and more a force of nature, a shadow returning to reclaim the light for those who could no longer see it. "Only if you want it to be," he whispered to the biting wind, the phrase serving as both a tender memory of Sarah's lost hope and a grim, ironclad vow for the coming dawn. The boundary of the town fence loomed before him in the dark, a physical choice to cross back into a world that had already written his ending in ink and blood. As the first grey light of morning began to peel back the suffocating layers of the night, the silence of Lincoln became a physical weight, a canyon of unspoken truths waiting for a catalyst. Billy stood at the northern edge of the main thoroughfare, his silhouette tall and lean, the texture of the morning mist clinging to his leather gear like a second, colder skin. The memory of the scorched farm rose in his throat, a bitter taste of smoke and burnt lavender that no amount of desert dust could ever fully scrub away from his soul. She couldn't fight the fire, and the town couldn't fight the man with the badge, but Billy was a mirror that would reflect every injustice back upon the man who wore the star. He stepped into the center of the street, the rhythmic, lethal jingle of his spurs, the only funeral march the town would hear before his Winchester began, its final, rhythmic prayer of lead and lightning. "Thank you, mister," she whispered, her eyes wide. He handed her a small carved wooden bird he'd made during the long nights in the desert, a small act of kindness in a place that forgot how to smile. He noticed the bruise on her arm, where a deputy had pushed her aside earlier. The fire in his chest, once a wild blaze, had distilled into a cold blue flame of resolve. "Go home, little one," Billy said softly. "Stay inside tomorrow." The atmosphere in the local saloon, the Silver Spur, was a powder keg. The floorboards groaned under heavy boots, and the air was a thick fog of cigar smoke and desperation. The sheriff sat in the corner, his Stetson pulled low, his fingers drumming a restless beat on the scarred mahogany table. He was a man who owned the law but possessed no justice. The boundary was set. The fence that the sheriff had built around the wrong farm wasn't just made of barbed wire, it was made of greed. Billy stood at the edge of the town square as the moon rose, a silver blade cutting through the clouds. He felt the cold bite of the night air, a sharp contrast to the simmering rage in his gut. "It's time," Chavez whispered from the darkness of an alleyway. Billy adjusted his neckerchief, the fabric coarse against his throat. He wasn't just an outlaw anymore, he was a reckoning. The bad guy was coming back to collect a debt that couldn't be paid in gold. He stepped into the moonlight, his spurs jingling a soft, lethal melody against the frozen ground. The storm had finally arrived. The dawn broke grey and heavy, the sun a pale ghost behind a shroud of dust. The main street of Lincoln was a canyon of silence. The only sound was the rhythmic creak slap of a loose shutter and the distant moan of the wind. Billy stood at one end of the street, his silhouette tall and lean, a shadow cast by the history books of the future. The sheriff stepped out of his office, his badge catching the weak morning light. He looked at Billy, and for a moment the bravado vanished. He saw not a killer, but a mirror of his own failures. Behind the sheriff, his deputies fanned out, their hands hovering over their holsters like nervous birds. "You should have stayed in the desert, kid," the sheriff yelled, his voice cracking. "You burned the wrong farm, Pat." Billy's voice was a calm tide. You burned a woman's life because you were too cowardly to face me. The duel was not a flash of cinematic glory, but a sudden, violent eruption. The smell of black powder filled the air, acrid and stinging. Billy moved with a fluid, terrifying grace. "Only if you want it to be," he whispered to the ghost of Sarah Miller as his Winchester spoke. The sheriff's men fell back, overwhelmed not by numbers, but by the sheer, focused intensity of a man who had nothing left to lose. When the smoke cleared, the sheriff lay in the dirt, his polished boots now covered in the same grey ash that had buried the Miller farm. Billy didn't pull the trigger a final time. He stood over him, the barrel of his gun still warm, the scent of lavender, perhaps a trick of the mind, wafting on the breeze. He reached down and tossed the tarnished brass key onto the sheriff's chest. "Rebuild it," Billy said, his voice hard as flint. "Every timber, every fence post, or I'll come back from the desert again." They watched. The townspeople emerged from their homes, watching the notorious killer walk toward his horse. He didn't take the money from the bank. He didn't burn the town. He simply mounted his horse and looked toward the western horizon, where the Apache lands lay. The final reflection was one of a complex justice. The land didn't belong to the law, and it didn't belong to the outlaws. It belonged to those who bled for it, and those who tended it with kindness. Billy rode away into the shimmering haze, a figure of myth and mystery. As he reached the edge of town, he looked at a small flower pushing through the cracked earth near a fence. "Only if you want it to be," he muttered, a faint smile touching his lips, before he vanished into the golden dust of the frontier.